Good morning. This is Faith in Our Hometown, brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin. And now, here's your host, Father Jay Friedel.
Hey everybody, happy Sunday. And we're again honored that you decided to spend part of your Sunday morning with us right here at Faith in Our Hometown. We're going to talk about what's been on everybody's mind, and we're sick of talking about it, but I think there's a new way to think about this a little bit, and that is the plague, otherwise known as this world that we live in of COVID-19. Okay, so how do we, in so many ways, wrap our brains around some of the pieces about this that I think that our medical community worries about? And so I've invited Tracy Borgmeyer, who's the ethicist at Mercy Hospital, and we'll talk about what an ethicist is in a minute, okay? But we're going to talk a little bit about why it's so important that we keep our hospitals, both Freeman and Mercy, you know, with our patient loads down, why that's so important, and why everybody worries about those things, and why we're still trying to keep people from getting sick, and why we keep telling everybody to keep wearing masks and doing all those things. So we're going to talk about that right after this Mercy Minute. So don't go away, grab your cup of coffee, and join us right after this.
Hi, I'm Karen Brown. Last year, my sister was diagnosed with ovarian stage 3C cancer in her early 40s. As a mother of two beautiful children, I didn't think twice about undergoing genetic testing here at Mercy. Even though I have grandparents and an uncle battle cancer, seeing a genetic counselor wasn't something that ever crossed my mind until my sister's results showed that she was BRCA2 positive.
We've come a long way, especially in about the last 5 years. Genetic testing can pinpoint the cancers that you are at highest risk for in order to detect them earlier or, if possible, prevent them.
My genetic counselor at Mercy, Robin, took note of my family health history and answered all of my questions. She even suggested my brother get tested. Robin said if he tested positive, he may be more likely to be diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and that is what I lost my uncle to.
There are many other types of cancer that are also possibly hereditary, such as colorectal cancers, pancreatic cancers.
I honestly was prepared to hear that I was positive, but indeed I was negative. And what a huge relief that was, not only to me, but to my family, to know I wasn't at a great risk of developing breast or ovarian cancer.
Diet, lifestyle choices such as smoking or drinking all contribute to our risk for cancer. Genetic testing is taking just kind of one piece of that. Talk to your primary care doctor or your OBGYN and ask for a referral to a genetic counselor.
Well, again, hey everybody, thanks for joining us for this Sunday morning on Faith in Our Hometown. We're going to be talking a little bit about, and we're somewhat sick of talking about it, but I think we got a new angle to actually, that I want everybody to kind of wrap their brains around, because I think this is kind of important. And in order to do this, I will introduce to you Tracy Borgmeyer. Tracy is our ethicist at Mercy, and this conversation and us talking about this came from a conversation we had on a parking lot. We were crisscrossing, going in and out of Mercy. And we were in the middle of a big blow up. There was a big spike in Springfield, and the Springfield hospitals were getting overrun. Both Cox and Mercy and Springfield were getting overrun, and everybody was so worried. And we were like watching the numbers to make sure that they weren't going to spike here the same way. Glory be to God, they did not. We were not, overtaken at the same time, but. We talked about why the fact that that's so important. And so I want to talk about that this morning. But before we do that, Tracy, your position is the ethicist.
Right.
So why don't you tell everybody what an ethicist is or does?
My best response to that is that ethics isn't something that I do, it's something that we all do.
Good.
And so infusing ethics, our ethical obligations, if you want to think of it that way, the moral commitments that we make, that's a part of every discipline in healthcare. That's a part of the Sisters of Mercy. It's a part of our administrators. It's a part of our financial leaders, our financial executives. It truly is, there are ethical commitments along everything that we do as a healthcare system.
And again, let's say we could take that into the business community. We won't today, but I'm just saying we could take that into the business community and realize that, again, that's what we teach at business ethics at school. That's what we teach, healthcare ethics. We do how do we conduct ourselves in that way and in society. And I think that that's important. So what we're going to be talking about this morning also, so much of it is going to apply to, what Freeman has to do too, obviously.
Right.
But I knew you, and we had this conversation in the parking lot, and that's why you're here this morning talking about this. So when we talk about this whole business of why is it so important that we keep those numbers low? Because everybody's just like, well, let's just let everybody get it, not worry about it, and then we'll be over it and done and blah, 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 blah. Why are we sometimes missing a piece when we take that focus rather than trying to keep the numbers low enough to be able to deal with it?
So I want to respond first to that comment that you made about why can't we get this over with, and some of what we are concerned about is that pandemic fatigue. You know, kind of just a fatigue after so many months
I've been there.
Of dealing with
this.
It's certainly something that people have questioned. Wouldn't it be better just to, let everybody be exposed if they get exposed and not worry about it, and we'll build immunity. That's one approach. It's not an approach that we know can work. It's an approach that we know can be disastrous for a community. And when we talk about our community, we're not just thinking about Mercy or Freeman. We're not just thinking about Joplin even. We're thinking about how does that impact Springfield? How does Springfield impact us? Tulsa, Rogers, Northwest Arkansas. So we really have to look at those, how this virus...
And all the communities in between.
Everywhere, yeah. So how this virus, how people in the community are exposed to the virus, how they need treatment, whether they need hospitalization, and the impact on your hospital. And I've heard a comment, over and over, we hear people say, well, it's so that we won't overwhelm our hospitals. I'm not sure that everybody really grasps what that means and what happens if we do get overwhelmed.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it.
And I want to tell you that we've taken a lot of effort on the part of all hospitals. Emergency management directors has gone into trying to make sure that we don't get there. But the cooperation of your whole community, at least a majority of your community cooperating with you in that, is so important. So just to talk about...
getting back to that's something we do
Yeah.
rather than something that Mercy does
No,
or that Freeman does.
It's up to all of us. Everyone has a role to play. So what we talk about, like standards of care, the first standard of care that's just normal time, not a crisis, not a concern about scarce resources, is just a conventional standards of care. That's the kind of care that you can expect when you go to the doctor or the hospital and there's no concern about crisis or scarce resources. The next level of that is a contingency standard of care, and that is where you really go into a conservation mode, where you have to be concerned and planning for what you're going to need in terms of your human resources, your pharmaceuticals, your PPE, your equipment, everything that you might need, even how well you coordinate with the other people in your community. Having a policy that you put side by side and say, are we all taking a pretty consistent, very similar approach to how we will manage it if we get into that situation. The crisis standard of care is what we're all trying to avoid. And when you hear someone say, we don't want to overwhelm our hospitals, that's not just about having one afternoon where the ER waiting room is really full. It really...
Or we don't want to work that hard or whatever.
Sure. It really is about not having everyone and every piece of equipment and every kind of medication that you might need from the time somebody presents in need of help, in a crisis, in a critical condition or a near critical condition, to everything that we need to take good care of that person. Physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, in our training as healthcare professionals, we're trained to look at the individual patient and think about all the benefit that we can provide to that one individual patient. If you're in a situation where you had 10 patients in need and only enough treatment that you could provide to 5, it would create serious moral distress and a standard of care that falls below that ethical, moral commitment that you want to make for that quality of care, that quality and safety of care.
You don't want to get into a situation where you're saying, okay, we're going to save you, but we can't save both of you, so we're going to pick you instead of pick you.
And so if you do that, then you have to have procedures in place that require a whole team, a good amount of clinical certainty, and a very just process for how you would implement that in a way that does not cause great burden for some people and benefit for others. So there's justice, is certainly an ethical commitment that we make. Beneficial care is a commitment that we make. Before all of that starts is what we did for several months in the very beginning, which is your duty to plan. And that's not just the healthcare system, that's emergency management and all of the city officials, everyone has had some piece of that. Schools have, but you have that ethical duty to plan. You can't just say, we'll worry about it if it happens.
When it happens.
Yes, you have to assume that you could be affected. And then if you're not as affected as you feared you might be, that's a good thing, but you were better prepared because you didn't say, we won't worry about it yet. And then you also have a duty to care, and that duty to care extends to every patient that you have, regardless of their need. And even when it's not possible to cure, you still have that duty of non-abandonment, that duty to not let that patient have unmet needs, even if you can't cure them.
Yeah. And that's been tough during this time.
Absolutely.
It's just like, how do they keep all the ministers safe while they're trying to take care of people who are dying and doing all that stuff? I mean, I hate that because normally I'm very hands-on, and I can go in and stroke the person's head or hold their hand or do whatever I need to do. And that's so hard to do when you can't get into the room because
we've had to balance that desire to meet all of the needs of the patient with the obligation to keep people safe.
Yeah.
And how you weigh out and balance those two ethical commitments that are sometimes held in tension with one another is part of your process. We all think of wisdom as being a virtue. That's your timeless truths, but then there's so much prudential judgment. So prudence comes into play too. The prudential judgment that makes a judgment about today's circumstances that might not have been a week ago and might not exist a week from now, but it's a prudential judgment about what is the context that we're working in today. Yeah. So just to touch a little bit on some of the virtues that we try to call forth from every member of the team when we're involved in this kind of unusual situation.
Well, and again, it's that whole business about this is what we have to do. How do we make sure that those things are being met? And so lots of conversations. I mean, I know even in terms of, because we had to decide early on, are we going to allow every minister into a room? Or are we going to do, and it's just like, even I don't get to go into, the COVID rooms themselves, but I can be outside and I can through the glass and we can talk to the person on the phone if they're conscious or those things. But it's all has to be part of that conversation about how do we take care of the whole thing.
Yes.
So my guest this morning is Tracy Borgmeyer. Tracy's the ethicist at Mercy Hospital here in Joplin. And so we're going to be right back after a real quick break to talk a little bit about how do we respond as a community during this time of plague to all the issues that get dumped in our laps because we got something we can't deal with as well as we want to.
You're watching Faith in Our Hometown on KSN TV, brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin.
Well, again, thank you for staying with us this morning for Faith in Our Hometown. This is a kind of a cerebral discussion in some ways. I mean, it's all, kind of like it's kind of highfalutin in the language we're using and everything else. But I'm grateful to you, Tracy, for coming and talking to us about some of this. Because again, I'm not so sure that we as a community have dealt with that. So how do we respond when when we get, some of those folks that just say, oh, the heck with it, we should just all get sick, and how do you respond to that in the concrete?
I actually had a really good conversation one day with a colleague, and I think it was some of the pandemic fatigue that might have been showing through, just, and her comment was, shouldn't we just rip the Band-Aid off? Just rip the Band-Aid off. And she said, you're probably not the person to say that to. And I think bearing in mind, this is not gonna go on forever. We're working really hard to keep as few people exposed to this virus as possible. And we know that we have to pay special attention to groups that are really vulnerable. So people with multiple medical conditions and people who are higher risk. We have to be especially cautious there. And they have needs in the community too. Not everyone has somebody who can do all their shopping for them or who can run all of their errands for them. We have members of our community who really do not have the family or the resources to pay somebody to bring groceries or bring dinner or whatever. They do need to get out and do what they can. I love it that a lot of our businesses have set aside like special times of the week or days of the week when they encourage people to come. I think that those are creative ways to keep things moving, get people's needs met, and not just their needs to be safe, but needs for jobs. That's the kind of creative, ingenious thinking that we need to continue. We talk about American exceptionalism, and I think we talked in an earlier segment about we should not need a tragedy to pull together.
Right.
Sometimes something has to get our attention in ways that truly are tragic, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can find ways, to pull together and balance the ethical commitments that we have when those seem like they're a little bit held in tension.
Sure.
So back to the comment about should we just rip off the Band-Aid and get this over with. We talked for a little while about what would that be like, and if we have 23 patients right now who need COVID treatment, what would it be like if we suddenly had 46, and it doesn't take much imagination at all to realize how overwhelmed we would be in that circumstance. And if we could not find a relief valve, another hospital that was prepared to take the patients that we could not care for the way we wanted to care for them, if we couldn't find that relief valve because everybody was doing the same thing at the same time,
right.
Just allow the exposure to happen, we would have to implement crisis standards of care. And that is that standard of care where a clinical team has to step in and make decisions about treatment that normally, under normal circumstances, I as a patient want to make for myself. And if I can't make them for myself, I want my family to make them for me, along with the physicians. In crisis standards of care, if you want to think of a comparable thing in another context, we all understand triage that is involved in combat zones.
Right.
People who are wounded, critically wounded, have to be prioritized for who can be helped and who needs treatment faster, who needs to get in sooner, and who cannot be saved. Those are the decisions.
Yeah, triage was something that if you watched MASH or if you've ever been in the emergency room,
right,
and you wonder why these 4 other people are going ahead of you, that's what's happening is that triage. Those things are, so which one of these is going to come to the top of the list and who do we need to deal with first so that everybody's going to be okay in the end result.
Yes, but the moral distress that creates in a community for healthcare professionals, families, patients, is something we want to avoid. And if we can hang in there, we will be able to avoid being in that situation and allow time for therapeutics and hopefully vaccines and those kinds of interventions, those kinds of widespread, the national public health strategies that we need to be in place before we can relax. Mm-hmm. Let our guard down a little bit.
So in other words, to say, once we figured out, and again, we're learning more about this thing all the time, mm-hmm. but when we learn more about it, learn how to treat it, figure out how, what kind of treatments are going to be the ones that get people over those big humps, you know, of the pneumonias and the, you know, inability to breathe and, you know, and all this stuff, or the neurological problems, or, you know, the long-term things. How do we, you know, how do we mitigate how do we help get in there and stop some of that long-term damage from being able to be done?
Right.
You know, when we can figure all that out and we've got better strategies, everybody will breathe a little bit easier.
Sure.
Because when everybody comes in there, it's not going to be as much of a guessing game. It's not quite as much of a guessing game now as it was 6 months ago.
Right.
But
we have learned some things, and we're still learning.
Yeah.
And we need to be prepared. I think of it a little bit like not being hit by a tornado, because it's different than a natural disaster that happens. It's really more about how we had to work through the aftermath and the recovery. And that was where everyone got fatigued. You know, in the immediate post-disaster, you function on adrenaline for a long time. Yeah. And then at some point, you know, that fades away a little bit, and you have to figure out how are we going to keep going in a way that is you know, the safest for all, but also in a way that allows our whole community to thrive the best we can in the time of plague, so to speak. And those are the things that we really want people to have. Nobody needs to have, you know, a perfect understanding of it, but having a better understanding of what do we mean when we say not overwhelming our healthcare system. Yeah. And
again, that's why I said, that's why I wanted to do this show, just because I wanted everybody to kind of understand what that concept was and why it was so important. Because I just don't think people think about it. I think it would be easier mentally for us to say, okay, let's rip off the Band-Aid, let's just let everybody get it and see where it falls. But again, my whole thing there is that, you know, if some of my 90-year-old parishioners are going to wind up getting a worse version and wind up not being able to breathe, and because of their other health concerns not being able to do that, how do we take care of them at the same time?
Right.
You know, and who's going to volunteer their grandma to be the one in there? Or who's going to volunteer their 2-year-old who winds up with a difficult case?
When you think about, you know, the moral commitment that we have in healthcare, we're here every time we can to restore health. We're here to prevent disease from worsening when it's possible. We always have that duty to care, and we can't identify a segment of our community, of our population, that we're no longer going to owe that duty to. We can't just say we're not going to worry about this group or that group anymore. Human dignity, that inherent human dignity, that notion that every human being is created in the image and likeness of God, that's how deep that is. When you think about that inherent worth, we can't diminish that in any way.
Yeah, at least certainly not according to my belief system.
Right.
Because that's one of my strongest things. Everybody wonders why I fight for all the different issues. You know, it's just like, that's why I will fight, you know, personally, I fight against anybody taking anybody else's life, no matter which way it happens. Yeah. Whether it's on death row, whether it's abortion, whether it's robbery, and somebody's dignity being, you know, somebody being killed in some that way. And I'm against it all, because that dignity of the human person, I just believe, is put there by God. And that's where I land on it. Now, I know that there are people who disagree with all that, and we just have to, you know, kind of have the argument. But that's what the core.
When you think about the virtues that we're trying to call forth from people, you know, in the process of making difficult decisions, many of those virtues are there for people of faith and people who have no particular faith affiliation. Accountability, transparency, fairness, justice, those are things that we can apply across the board. Right. And we believe that those are applicable no matter who you are or what you believe. We all want to live in a society that is just, and I want to know that if I'm in the emergency room, that care will be determined in a way that is fair, I understand that somebody who's more...
So in other words, not just somebody who's got money versus somebody who
Sure.
doesn't. Yeah.
I understand that somebody who's more critically ill than I am is going to get care before I do, and if I can wait, I'll wait. And I know that they'll prioritize my needs, accordingly. But we want to live in, and we want to get our health care in a community that will look out for each other in that way.
Yeah. And I do think that's one of those things, again, that makes our community so strong, is for the most part, when you can explain it to people, I think they start to get it. I think, I don't think anything that we've talked about tonight is unreasonable. In terms of just saying. So I mean, that's why we continue to do what we try to do. We continue to say to people, just don't get sick. Wear your mask. Do your thing, whatever, so that we can try to do that. My guest this morning is Tracy Borgmeyer, who's the ethicist at Mercy, Joplin, and we've been talking about how we can take care of each other as a community that cares about each other. Okay, so we're going to be right back after this Mercy Minute.
A new baby changes the world and each of us. The Sisters of Mercy devoted themselves to offering exceptional maternity and delivery care, training generations of nurses to do the same. Mercy continues to answer the same call, to not only care for your baby, but to cherish them too. Mercy, in every era, your life is our life's work. Learn why we serve at mercy.net/legacy. In Ireland, the first Sisters of Mercy were called the Walking Sisters because every day they went out in search of women and children who needed healing or help. Mercy continues to answer the same call, dedicated to the health of every woman who comes to us for care. Mercy, in every era, your life is our life's work. Learn why we serve at mercy.net/legacy.
Well, again, thanks for joining us for another Sunday morning on Faith in Our Hometown. I hope that you're not worn out yet by some of our conversations because I know that the fatigue is setting in, and I know we just all want it all to be over, and I understand that. But I really think it's important that we continue to wrap our brain and our heart around this, because one of the things I really truly believe about our Joplin community is that we care, and that most people will care when they understand what's at stake. And so that's why we wanted to talk a little bit about some of those ethical issues surrounding this whole thing. It's not just that people want to control somebody else's freedom and say, you can do this or you can't do that. It's about how do we take care of each other. That needs to be one of those things that we need to hold dear for all of us, regardless of any of our beliefs. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next Sunday for Faith in Our Hometown.
Thanks for watching. Faith in Our Hometown can be seen Sunday mornings at 6:30 and 9 a.m. on KSN. Brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin.